Welcome everyone just joining us to today's webinar, Effective Data Analytics to Detect Travel and Entertainment and Procurement Card Fraud. My name is Peter Goldman. I'll be your webinar co-moderator. I'm a principal in the webinar sponsor, Fraud Resource Net, and with me is my colleague Jim Kaplan, also a principal of Fraud Resource Net. In the interest of saving time and allowing the maximum amount of time for our presentation today, you can read Jim's and my bios on the slides that you should have received. I would, however, like to invite our guest panelist, Rich Lanza, to share a bit about his background. For those of you who have been with us in the past on Rich's presentations, bear with us. For those of you new to this, to Rich, I'm sure you'll be impressed with what his credentials show. Rich?
Yeah, no, thanks again, Peter, and thanks everyone for coming today. I, will be going through a lot as always. I try to give a lot out as ideas, and in a lot of ways what you have in your slides is a bit of an audit program using analytics. I've been doing this over 20 years, trying lots of different techniques, and finding some of the simple techniques that we're going to talk about today are the most effective in finding fraud and finding issues and errors. Yeah, with that said, back to you, Peter, and we can continue on with with the housekeeping.
Good. Thank you very much, Rich. Just to pick up where Rich left off, we do have a few housekeeping points to get through before we start. This webinar is part of our 2015 webinar series entitled Detecting and Preventing Fraud Using Data Analytics. As mentioned, these webinars are presented to you by Fraud Resource Net, a new premium online portal of how-to articles, webinar recordings, fraud audit templates, tools, and white papers. We invite you and encourage you to visit www.fraudresourcenet.com, all one word, to preview the features of that portal for anti-fraud practitioners and sign up. Before we get started, we want to make sure that you have a smooth experience technologically. Please make sure that pop-ups are allowed on your computer. In addition, this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to that recording within 5 to 7 business days. We also invite you to ask questions at any time during Rich's presentation. All you need to do is type your question into the box at the lower right-hand corner of your screen and press Enter to send it to us. With regard to CPE credits, if you wish to earn the 2 credits offered by attending this webinar, please be sure to answer all of the polling questions that will be put up on your screen at intervals throughout the presentation. And then your CPE certificate will be emailed within 5 to 7 business days. Finally, when the webinar ends, you'll be invited to provide feedback in a brief survey. We encourage you to take a moment just to fill that survey out, as your feedback is extremely valuable in our efforts to continually improve the quality of these webinars for you. Without further delay, then, I'd like to thank Rich for standing by and invite him to begin his presentation now.
Great. Well, thanks again, Peter. And for the agenda today, or for the next 2 hours, what we're going to talk about are the different types of ways of finding T&E fraud, mostly using data analytic proactive tests, but talking about other tests as well. The key here is I want to kind of look at the different types of data files that you should be looking for and putting together, and I even have some sample data which many of you should have by now and can even play along in the presentation. I also do a lot of different types of just general analysis, like digital and letter and word analytics, because I think you can learn a lot about your T&E data just from that, and I think it's worthwhile just to do that. And then just kind of talking about how to set it up in a regular fashion. But, I think the issue we've had for years with T&E type audits is that T&E audits are have a bit of a bad name, in that the upper management usually and the top management, like top performers, are usually the ones that are T&E offenders, let's just say it, and it's tough to kind of put them on the judgment stand, given their position in the company and or value in the company, and therefore it's sort of, is the 2 or 3% where you're going to have some fraud here, is it worth the risk from a political point of view for you? And so just keep that in mind. I mean, I think a lot of people, I think it's even 99% of people are honest. But I think also, with keeping this in mind, what I found is that EPCard data is becoming a new way of paying invoices, and because of that, it's increased in usage. And what we're finding is, because of that, people are much more worried about what's going through there. So this may be more of just a EPCard review for you as opposed to T&E, and in that case, that actually has a lot of value because we're just kind of looking at EPCard in general. But kind of coming back though, if you know that there are some executives and sales executives that are kind of top ranking and whatnot in the organization, I think what you want to look for are the other people, the people that have large T&E but are not on that list. So, I think it's not bad to kind of realize that these are some of the truths when you go in and do a T&E review. Somebody may tell you to kind of put it under the carpet, but I think it's also a way of thinking about, basically discrepancy. And people that are outside of that norm that have a high value. Okay, so looking at the different types of frauds that are out there, my little, a couple of ACFE study slides here, and this one here showing expense reimbursements as kind of a low value, but a relatively high risk. It's something that's happening. Billing fraud, though, which is over on the right-hand side, is setting up a new vendor and paying it, which you can do through a EPCard system. It's very easy to set yourself up as a Square vendor, to go out and buy the little Square at Starbucks, and then to kind of make yourself a vendor. So I think billing fraud, and the fact that it's over to the right here is as high risk, high dollars. Take a look at that one. I mean, I think it's well worth looking into. I don't know if it's really check tampering or any of these other things will fit into kind of EPCard type land, but notice how a couple of the large areas that we would be looking for are right here on the chart. And what I find is interesting, I took this from I don't think this is from 2014, it might be from the 2006 survey, is in 53% of cases where there was expense reimbursements, 40.7% had check tampering as well, or the perpetrator was engaged in a billing scheme. So the fact that these two go together is clearly presented in the study, and also I think it's a bellwether. I mean, if you have somebody who's playing games on expense reimbursements, what else are they doing? Is it kind of the tip of the iceberg? Is it a way of kind of realizing or profiling? And as to profiling, you do want to look at the different types of departments. I mean, if you have somebody in accounting where expense reimbursement is pretty low in fraud kind of usage or occurrence, maybe if you do have somebody here that has a very high balance of T&E, to look into that. Now, that person might be associated with a implementation of a software system, and are traveling around, implementing the system. I mean, there are reasons why accountants get on planes and trains and whatnot, but generally speaking, it's in operations and it's in executive management. It's in sales, and hence why it's right at the top. And notice how billing schemes is right under that, or right above that. And then corruption, which we're also going to talk about, is also there. So, and the reason corruption, we'll talk about it, is a lot of corrupt payments are made through T&E, and sort of the entertainment that's given, and as well as the different types of advanced fees that are just given to people, sometimes flow through the EPCard. So with all that, keep that kind of in your head a bit as we go into the different types of tests. So as we think about T&E fraud, and there's a great book that I referenced like 10 times in here that you'll see in a second, but this is right out of the ACFE study. It's out of the ACFE books. If you read any of their books, they're quite good at giving, like I use corporate fraud a bit, and it gives you like all the controls and things like that. Fraud Resource Net would also have a lot of this information, so that aside from analytics, you can kind of get a lot of the good controls and good kind of talk that we really should be putting in our audit reports. So types of T&E fraud, again, per the ACFE study, you're miscategorizing personal as business, you're overstating things, you're putting in fictitious receipts, you're buying stuff that you don't need, which is kind of a billing scheme, actually. Like I think there is a billing scheme portion where a person just over purchases, and the vendor doesn't even know. I mean, they don't realize. They give you 2 laptops, not 1 laptop, and then realize they don't really care. But the company may realize that person now has 2 laptops versus 1. One is at home and being used by the kid or something. And then obviously there's collusion where the manager and the employee get together. And I think there are controls on collusion now. A lot of times the top ranking executive needs to kind of pay for the event. So that way that is then approved by somebody else that wasn't at the dinner table. But a lot of times a person will just say, hey, you put it through and I'll approve it. And then that makes life a lot easier in explaining expenses up to the boss a lot of times. So, I mean, this gives you kind of the overall types. And when you think about, there was this great book that we'll get to in a second, how to commit T&E fraud and get away with it, basically is the name of the book. And what it did was it broke down, and I like this, just kind of on over-purchasing or fake receipts, like going back to here, just by overstating or having fictitious receipts. You could be increasing, say, gas and mileage by, the mileage, you just kind of make it a little higher. The airline, you could buy a non-refundable ticket. We'll talk about this scheme, but and use the non-refundable as your charge, but then have another basic, a refundable ticket that you fly on that's a lot cheaper, and then you refund the non-refundable, or excuse me, I think I got that right. The refundable is the one that you return, and the non-refundable, which is a lot cheaper, you would then fly on. But the company pays for the refundable expensive ticket. All these different things that you could just be increasing, say, the documents that you're getting from the hotel or such. And by just a little bit, like here, there, and everywhere, you could add up very quickly to about $15,000 a year. Now, again, you'd have to be doing a fair number of trips, but still, it's not that many. When a lot of people will travel once every 2 weeks or so if they're in that traveling mode, and again, it can add up quickly. So, keep that in mind. It also kind of gets, I think, a bit addictive. It's something where what you'll find is a lot of these schemes will kind of grow over time. So it may start out, a person is taking 10,000, 15,000, and then in the next year is taking 25, 35,000, etc. So the things can kind of grow, is tax-free, and for that employee, there is a feeling of kind of getting back at the company, or I'm traveling, I'm doing a lot of stuff here. But I still think that last comment, the slippery slope, the fact that if you have expense reimbursement fraud, it tends to lead to other crimes. It's sort of the gateway fraud, and by having that, as a bellwether, you may be able to profile employees better, and then kind of take a look at them in other activities. From if they're in accounts payable, let's say, you might want to look at what they're doing in accounts payable and look at the vendors they're setting up and the dollars they're spending, and kind of make it more of a research of somebody. Okay, so at this point, we want to do the first polling question, so let me get that up there. So, from the list that we were talking about, what is not one of the top occurring types of fraud per the CFE study? Asset misappropriation, corruption, other document fraud, or all of the above? And I see that most of you voted. I try my best here. I'm looking now at the questions. Sorry, I didn't have a chance to look at them as we were going so far. A couple of questions, one product related, how can you obtain 101 ASIL applications? You can email me is the best way, and I can just work something out with you. We currently sort of don't have it for sale online very easily, so yeah, if you want to just email me, we can take care of that. I'm at rich@richlanza.com. And the next one, on the types of T&E fraud, you list 5 types, and 4 of them can be audited. Collusion is really difficult to audit. How do you find that? I think, or are there ways to detect it? And I think the answer is, it is a lot harder because but I think what you could do is kind of look at the amount or count of times that people are approving things for certain people, and kind of looking at, if one person's approving it, does it kind of skyrocket versus other people approving that person? And again, it may only be one person that approves them, but I think looking at that enter or approver can kind of quickly tie you into collusion. I notice everyone's voted. Let me just close that poll and share it with everybody. And I think what is not one of the top occurring, it's probably other document fraud. So those that said that asset misappropriation was like billing fraud and check fraud and those things. So all of the above is out as well. But we didn't go through that in depth, I understand. So but you don't get marked for wrong answers. We're just kind of logging in who's answering. So let me get back to this question, though, on the T&E fraud and collusion. What I have done a lot of analysis of is transactions that look weird, and we'll talk about scoring at the end of this. And kind of think about, from a scoring point of view, what you could do is score transactions, and for example, a transaction is round, a transaction's posted on a weekend that the person's also on holiday, et cetera, the various like weird things. And if you then summarize that by enterer and approver, you can usually find the collusion that way too. So I mean, that is a way of sort of pulling it out when it you think you can't do it. I think there are some ways. We've even like I don't show this slide anymore, but I used to have a slide where it was various dartboards, and I was basically saying, score on the merchant or the vendor, score on the person who entered it, score on the approver, and take a look at kind of the rate, and I guess in this case, score on the T&E department person who actually took care of it and did the travel, and if you looked at all of those together, you should be able to quickly kind of analyze and see what are the transactions that have a top score across many different elements, and usually, like, if it's a certain vendor with a certain person and a certain whatever, there is a good chance, but a fine inclusion. So we'll talk about scoring more later. Hopefully this makes a bit of sense, and I think I still think you can do it. So what I like to do, and kind of going to this next one, and another question came in, can you please explain more around non-refundable, refundable tickets? We have a slide on it. I will tell you it's probably like slide 15, 20. It's slide 22, and yes, we will get to that, so thank you for that question as well. Key steps to committing T&E fraud. Now, the reason I kind of start with the steps that a person may perform is I think it's a more complete way of thinking about it. I always tell the story, but I remember a movie, Ben Affleck directed it, starred in it, called The Town, and it was about a group of men who rob banks for a living, and what they do to kind of cover up their tracks, and I found it really interesting. Just thinking about, how would we catch this person? Like, what they had done was they thought through sort of, how do they catch us, and then created this approach of kind of getting rid of all of those red flags. So, one thing that obviously, if people delete data from a system or something like that, and it's all sort of manual at that point, it is hard sometimes to go back and build an audit trail. And I think similarly, though, or alternatively, if a person does commit one of these fraud tasks, they tend to leave a trace behind. And that's what I gained from that movie, was that, as they're kind of robbing this bank, they're leaving behind all these DNA and other types of traces that they need to get rid of or cover up. And I think, so therefore, I do believe by taking the tasks and, then a little bit later we'll talk about, some of the reports that you would run for these tasks. I think this is a more complete way, and I tried my best. I mean, I'm not saying that this is the most complete list ever, but it's a pretty complete list of things that somebody would do in kind of committing a fraud. So one thing might be to submit claims for personal expenses and be on a business trip, and we'll try to talk later, but if you can get the vacation dates of people and line it up to your EPCard data, that's a really good thing. The bypass review, by approving own claims in your system, you should be able to track who entered it and who approved it, and if it's the same person, boom, that's a quick match. But again, a lot of people don't think you're looking this way. So by sort of running all these reports and then adding them up, even by scoring, you're giving yourself a much improved chance of hitting somebody, because you're looking at it in all these different ways. You could create a fictitious vendor. You could split up purchases underneath an approval limit. It might be an option. You could submit claims for expenses of other employees that, again, this is the collusion thing, that also submit directly, but that way, by submitting it to that person instead of going directly to the boss, it makes it a lot easier to kind of cover up a crime. Submitting altered claims and or changing the amounts, adding a larger tip on it, obviously buying something twice and then getting a refund, but putting through 2 expense charges for the same item. So looking for duplicates is also like a test for fraud, even though you wouldn't think it. You'd think it would just be a mistake, or the vendor is committing fraud on the company, but it could be something else. I do want to note, and we'll note it in a few minutes, but I'll just note it here, is the one way around a lot of this is to have a EPCard, because EPCards save all this data, and it can't be edited by the employees, as far as I know. So if they do go off and pay off their Home Depot charge at Home Depot, and instead of buying stuff at Home Depot, they pay off their charge card. What you normally could do is just look up that purchase and see, how did it show up in the T&E system. But what's good is if they got a refund for that Home Depot charge, they bought something and literally got a refund for it, you would get the refund too. The company gets the refund. So, I think that really helps control things, to have that EPCard set up. But a lot of T&E systems, people are allowed to use whatever credit card they have, and by doing so, they have this ability to kind of hide what they're doing. We didn't do a study or a polling question on this, but it's like, I wonder how many people have a EPCard system and a T&E, and people are told to use the EPCard. I think it would be really varied. I think some people have nothing EPCard wise. Some people have a very extensive EPCard. So just kind of noting that. As we go to that refund point of duplicates, the only time that really happens is if the person has a different credit card that they're using. It's submitting it blank receipts or invented claims. You can actually go out to a website. I won't tell you how to do it, but it's a website to allow you to build a receipt, and you can just print it out, and it looks like an actual receipt that printed off a cash register. And I'm sure it's something like receipts.com. Again, other things to do is maybe using your own credit card to get some discounts, etc. But I think this covers, when you really look back at the different types of things that can happen and go wrong, it was a real attempt at trying to kind of collect all those tasks. And what somebody could then do, and we'll kind of do it today as part of the course, but I think what you should do is sit down and, for your system, because as we said, everybody's a bit different in what they do and how they use these things. You basically do a brainstorming session and use this as a bit of a guide. So, this being kind of the first guide, the different tasks that would be performed to commit fraud, and then thinking of all the reports. And again, we'll come up with a lot today, but that was sort of the first step. The second step is what are the different types of process steps, and thinking about at each point, what can go wrong, and could you create cards for a buddy or something, and canceling cards for employees that have left the company. I mean, that's something that I guess it's fraud, but the person may not remember, and just start using the card by mistake as well. I think what's nice is you can block merchants from a P-card point of view, so that really sets it up where the person has to use cash to pay for stuff, and then that gets flagged in a way, and that's being paid cash as opposed to P-card, and like, why is that? And if a person had a lot of cash that's being paid, that's really weird. So that's something per the TV. But these are good reasons why P-card systems are good things. But I know that there's a lot of control issues with them as well, and we'll obviously, at each one of these steps you could have a fraud going on, and it's hard sometimes to know it's happening until much later, unless you're taking a look at the data. So just going through a few more slides here, just on more of the general nature. There's P-card policy considerations with respect. We tried to jot down a lot of them here. We sort of reviewed online and thought about it. But these are the types of policies that somebody should be trained in, so that they understand what they can do and their rights and responsibilities. And most companies have a pretty good handle on this when they give a person a P-card. Now, from a fraud policy point of view, I think having some sort of policy and then communicating that to people, I'm sure Fraud Resource Net has training on the fraud policy, and I think that helps to get that around to a lot of people in the company, so that they know what they can do and can't do. I think with T&E fraud, more than everything or anything, is what we are what I kind of find more than anything is people just don't know it's fraud, so it becomes more of this gray area of buying something and not realizing it was on sort of a no-no list. So some of the basic tests that can be performed that I still think are oldies but goodies, and I don't think that you should sort of play these down. So yeah, a question came in that we could talk about in a second here. I'll just go back to P-card policy considerations. Are there any controls that reduce the risk of refunds that employee may pocket for expense reimbursements? I'm not sure if you can block that type of merchant code. It's getting a cashback credit is what I've heard it as when I've taken a look at the data. And I agree, any sort of cashback credit that somebody's getting, if I don't have that on my report list later, I really should, but I believe I do. And I think that that's something that you can monitor for sure. But yeah, from a restricting point of view, it would be kind of what are the different types of things that can and can't be purchased with the card and set up with the policy. And I mean, as assuming where the audit team is on the phone today, I think this is a really good thing to go grab. Is what is our P-card policy? We don't even may not have one. And then fraud policy, of course, training people in those basic things, and then the basic tests. What I think is just taking a look at the business purpose, doing a bit of a word summary on business purpose, and taking a look at what is happening in there. I think taking a look at expenses to that policy, and you can create a lot of automated tests here. I mean, things like if the same person can't enter and approve an invoice, that could be automated really quickly in your T&E or P-card data. The business purpose, of course, we'll talk about textual analytics, and I think that's kind of a great way to do it. But I do things like just summarizing on business purpose or the first 15 characters of the business purpose, and that can help a lot. Validating expenses with the receipts, of course. Recalculating amounts. A lot of this is, and I talked to some people that a lot of their T&E reviews are completely manual, that they don't really have a T&E system, and they have to kind of go to a folder where there's lots of expense reports. And I think that's what this is for. In a lot of ways, these basic tests are more for the people that are doing it more manually than any other way. So kind of just so as we kind of continue on now into some of the more fun types of tests, like these were sort of the basic tests, right, which are very good and are always something that we should do, so we should put them on the checklist, and hence why they're here. And now we kind of get into more of the fun ways of finding fraud and some of the things. And before we do that, I think the tip line is still one of your key ways, but analytics can play that role. Analytics can be a tip line, a proactive one. I think very few companies run this stuff, and I think that's unfortunately why. And I need to note, most frauds are detected based on a pattern of last frauds or past frauds within the entity. And I think even just looking at the trend of data over time and looking at how people just rise up in a given month or a given year is something that really should be taken under consideration. All right, so getting into question, what are automated bots here? I think I'm back here. You can have within, say, Concur, I think one of the top selling points of, let's say, Concur and other expense reimbursement systems is that you can automate a lot of the controls and have these kind of, I call it an automated bot, but it's really just a program that is checking what people are entering at the time and blocking it, that input control, or doing some sort of reporting and sending it to like a manager saying, this person's like really going high on the list, and hence we should take a look at them. So moving on, airline schemes and tests. This is all from this How to Pad Your Expense Report and Get Away With It book, which I thought was a great book, I still think is a great way. And a key point here, I'm sorry, I need to go back. The tip line is still the #1 way to find fraud, so that I need to kind of note that as we go on here. But the airline schemes and tests, what I find with the expensable refundable ticket and a cheaper ticket, you have to not be on the EPCard system, because if you get a refund, as we said before, it would detect that. So one of the ways, obviously, is to get the payment receipts and statements from people and check they didn't get a refund and all that. But most companies don't do that. So I think the EPCard can control those things. I think we'll say it later, but booking it for them, actually booking that flight for them, can be another great way of getting around that. But the way they do it is they'll book an expensive refundable ticket and put that through. So let's say it's $1,000, and then they'll buy a cheaper ticket, a non-refundable, and they'll fly on that, let's say for $300. They pocket the $700 difference because they refund the refundable ticket when they're flying out, on that non-refundable, and at that moment they refund it. They get a $1,000 credit back, and now they're $700 ahead of things. Now I'm finding that the airlines are getting a little bit better at this. But one thing that I'm finding is that the emails are kind of showing up more in sort of a JPEG or a PDF format. I am not a world traveler, but this is what I'm noticing. But at one point, you could get an email, and I'm sure anyone with like basic skills in digital type editing can take an email and do whatever they want with it and change the amounts and etc. Again, if the EPCard system is not there to kind of back up that a charge that goes through on the T&E, it's kind of hard to notice that. So something to consider in ensuring that either you book the airline for them, or make sure that you have them use the EPCard. A person may also kind of always pick a certain airline, even if it's not the best. And if a lot of companies have travel agent data, and we'll talk about data in a little bit, And what I'm finding is that people, by looking at the actual travel agency data, you can take a look at what was the cheapest flight for that given flight and relate it to what that person paid. So again, it's kind of an interesting indicator or variant or analytic. I do not know how to do this online, but I don't even know if it exists. But there might be a way of even kind of looking, for that given flight online and getting, an actual price. That was sort of the average price. And the reason I say that is, it's interesting how the travel agent is able to do that. Like, they must have an incredible information network that's backing them up to do that kind of stuff. Anyway, these are some of the schemes. Other schemes is, from a hotel point of view, what I've seen here, and this is a test we'll talk about later, so that I just mention it for this one, where a person was paying a credit card bill, literally, like, putting on the company credit card. They were paying off a credit card bill, and then they were using that charge as a charge from the Marriott, and they made an invoice for the Marriott, made it the same amount, and those lined up to the to that particular charge. Now, unless somebody had gone through and done that analysis of who is the vendor on the P card to who is the vendor in the T&E, unless somebody did that, you would never notice that, and hence why that's a great way to kind of commit fraud and etc. But a lot of the kind of easier ways, if you don't have a P-card system, is really just getting an invoice from the hotel, scan it in, do whatever you want to it. Other things that you could do is complain to reverse charges and then submit the original invoice, which kind of lines up to the discounting. Like, if you had a discount card and you give it to them afterwards, they're able to kind of, they'll deduct it, but later. So, somebody noted in some of the questions here, they have something called missed savings that the travel agency provides, which you're absolutely right. That's exactly what I'd seen it as called as well. Basically the minimum fare available, and I sometimes it's for that flight, so it was what was the minimum on that flight, and then it could also be across other flights, I'd assume. But yeah, I knew it was a very useful indicator, so I did want to note that. The other thing to note there, on that travel agent data, back to the question and this airline schemes, is the time that people bought it. If they bought it like the day of the flight, that's a much more expensive ticket, and it usually it's flagged by this other test that we're talking about, the value. But again, that was interesting to kind of look at people that are booking flights 2 days before. From a meal and schemes point of view, you can go to Staples and buy tear-off receipts that a diner would use, or any sort of food establishment that you'd go to, kind of mom and pop kind of establishment. They have this receipt book, and you could just use them. You could buy invoice paper or stock and use that, and it looks really professional, like it's real stuff. You can also kind of buy cheap meals and kind of submit through what somebody else put through, or even take a receipt from like the desk, meaning like a lot of times people throw their receipts out, and you could just grab a receipt from there and use that. I think kind of looking at dates of the receipt to the travel period can be useful as well, and you could do that with P-card data in relation to what people said per their T&E report. But again, it's a little tough and sometimes requires you going down to the actual payment receipt. Just some last ones here before we dive into some data files. From a taxi and mileage point of view, every taxi driver I know hands you a blank taxi bill. So it's more on the honor system, it seems, but the way they do it, and but that that happens. A lot of times you could put through a completely phony receipt and have somebody drive you to the airport. You could change mileage, so there might be a way to kind of get a mileage sense. I have not done it, but I have geo-mapped things, and I'm pretty sure you can calculate from a latitude longitude to the other. You could calculate the distance, and there's got to be some tool out there that does that. But that's it's something I'm writing these things down because these are good big data type things to think about as we're getting better at that. And we'll talk a little bit about kind of power mapping and graphing a little bit later. But back to the simple test of just kind of adding more mileage. It's something that is sort of hard to know if they've added 30 or 40 miles to the bill. And a lot of times, though, I think just looking at people that have lots of mileage is a way of identifying people that, are problematic. So, these are a little bit more advanced schemes, but definitely something, I think are key. And I'm trying to put down as many of these things and schemes and tasks that people can kind of do so that you can use this as a bit of a benchmark or a brainstorming tool in thinking up more and more reports. I think some of the things here is just getting a fictitious vendor and building, if you go to Starbucks, you could buy the square and, make yourself a square. I think looking for all the vendors that are square is key, and looking at that, because that's kind of odd for it to come up that way. A lot of times, taking a look at the name of that vendor in relation to the name of the person, the location of that vendor to the person. I think we talked about changing the vendor name between the EPCard and TNE system. This can really happen for anything. I mean, anybody could put through like a Marriott bill for $350 and just get paid on it. I mean, just create a phony bill. But this one's a little interesting that you're using the EPCard to make the payment, and then kind of covering it up. So it's a lot dirtier this way, actually. It's almost better to just say you paid cash or paid it on your own card, kind of thing. Avoiding approval limits. I mean, splitting purchases, and we can. I believe we can show that quickly today. Where just looking at stratifications of purchases and taking out ones that are right below an approval limit and summarizing it by vendor. And then some others here. But without further ado, let me get into our next polling question, just to kind of keep on track here. And what is the #1 way to detect fraud per past studies? Is it a strong EPCard policy, a management tip line, employee training, or a fraud policy? And what is a tip line is one of the questions I just need to note. The tip line is where you hire a company, or you have an internal group that looks into all the different types of violations of that company or issues that people have.
In context, just to interject, Rich,
sure.
Tip lines are, as the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners has reported repeatedly, tip lines are the most common way that frauds are detected. So more and more organizations we're finding are implementing either internally administered or third-party run tip lines, just as background. The ACFB does have additional information for those interested in further researching that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think even Epic's line may even be related to them. Yeah, it's a very popular one that I hear that name a lot. I don't know who uses what these days, but yeah. Cool. Let me. I'll keep this open for just another few seconds here. I think I've gone through all the questions so far, so that's good. But let me just kind of, for last-minute polling questions, I'll close that. And share that with the screen. And yeah, the management tip line is still the #1 way, as Peter noted, and when you look at it, and we'll talk about this in a second, actually in a couple of slides in a second here, but what I kind of notice is that if you add up all of the other ways of finding fraud, beyond just kind of the tip line, and I don't have an actual slide on it as I look at my slides here, but what that can do is by things like just management review and external audit and internal audit and all that, by kind of increasing all of those, you could almost have something that's more powerful than the tip line. And I think that's the whole point of proactive detection. So I wanted to kind of get into automating the tests of controls. and kind of talking about some of the key controls, basic controls, and also kind of show them. So far we've been talking about like what can go wrong and thinking about the types of reports, and I tried to throw a few report ideas at you, as we went through it. And later I have a list, that I tried my best to kind of throw out a bunch of top reports and such. That's all in there, and that ties it all together. But I think in the middle there, you have kind of what can go wrong, the reports, and in the middle are controls. And the summary here, obviously, whistleblower hotline, having somebody actually review the data that's in there and using it. The code of conduct, I mean, there could be EPCard violations that kind of go against some of these conflict of interest, making sure people are trained in it. The key here, I think booking it for them, like if a travel agent books it, they're going to, maybe challenge it even and say, we're not allowed to have you book it on this really expensive airline at first class when there is another ticket that is totally available at a lot less. And, that kind of takes away a lot of the potential. And I think with P-cards, I find too, I think one of the biggest concerns is that it sort of opens up a cash register for somebody to just go off and start buying things. And, I think in a lot of ways by, having it sort of auto-booked and the invoice sent to the company, it makes it a little bit of a cleaner act. Automating the workflow of approval. I do meet a lot of companies that their T&E is still manual. They're using Excel spreadsheets. They're passing them around. It's manually reviewed, etc. And I think getting to like a Concur or one of these other services is key. Talk about that. Reviewing the particular data itself. I think obviously having us just kind of review the data, what we're talking about today, and then obviously having some attitude when you're working with the actual fraudsters themselves. So I wanted to kind of throw out there all of the different types of controls that are in general. I mean, this isn't for expense reports, but are just in general, and saying what do you have? And most people have code of conduct, external audit, training, support programs, internal audit, management review. I mean, it's a pretty high percentage, upwards. Interesting that hotline is only at 52%, and I know it's like, I believe it's like an FCPA compliance thing. I believe it's also a Sarbanes-Oxley compliance thing. I'm not an expert on that aspect, but I'm pretty sure it is. And it's interesting that only 50% of companies do it. Proactive data monitoring, I'm excited to see it down at 36%. I kind of question that a little bit, but I do think for people to say, are you doing anything? Yeah, it's about 36%, and that's kind of what we're seeing across every study. PwC had a study recently that literally put it at like 35% of companies are using analytics on auditing. All right, well, with the controls at a high level, I wanted to kind of go back to, the different types of ways of kind of mapping things. And obviously we have the tasks, and, you should be kind of mapping that to the reports, and that's kind of part of the control of reviewing the data and something we'll talk about. Then the automated workflow. Is, I think a great thing. It enforces company policy. A lot of the controls are in there, and it's sort of like can't get paid unless the guy approves it and reviews it. It will look for a certain policy of being over a certain dollar limit. I almost feel like the controls are a bit limitless. Like you have a lot of options there, and more importantly, it gives you increased visibility. I mean, one of the things that we'll talk in a second, but we might as well just mention it now. When we were kind of using a manual T&E process, and we just went to an Excel document that had a lot more information in it, it had a lot more details in the Excel document, and it allowed you to kind of build a bit of a detailed Excel version of the T&E report. That gave such increased visibility. I mean, and just, what's nice about P-cards is it's kind of like a way of getting invoice data out of your system really quickly. I mean, you can just go online and kind of get it. So, I think there is the benefits of automation and kind of getting around this. really goes to that visibility probably more than, in my opinion, anything from a data analytic point of view. But then all the other control points of just automating controls is just sort of, good, it helps reduce audit fees as well, and peace of mind, and et cetera. We talked about booking at forum. I think using a car service, travel agency, the key is you're paying directly to the vendor, and so that helps. And just talking about kind of now the data part, and I'm going to just spend a little bit more time in the actual kind of data itself. But what I found really interesting, and they've never done this in the studies until 2014, is kind of laying out by detection method, the median loss and the duration. And notice way on the left-hand side is people that are surveillancing and monitoring. And surveillance, I had to ask them, it's not only data analytics. It's a lot of, they felt it was a lot of data analytics, but it was also just having like video monitoring and other types of profiling of employee behavior that was useful in detecting fraud. And notice there, by doing this type of activity, you can bring down your fraud losses by a third, to a third of what a tip line would be. And the tip line is still really good. Like only half of companies have tip lines, but and that's why the by accident is a lot longer and a lot bigger of a fraud. So now kind of getting into the data side of it. So we've talked through, we kind of know what goes wrong. We talked through some of the controls, and it's sort of a high level, and we'll, but talking more about approval controls and things like that are more detailed. And then kind of getting into the data that will ultimately get us to the reports, and what's available. What I've worked with before is an online T&E system, like a Concur. It could be in the company itself, but it is still something is still something that happens. And the travel company, car service company may have data as well, and that's something that you can gather. We were just talking about how you could get from the travel agency everything they booked, and it's basically the bill that you're going to pay them. But it tells you all this other information of like other flights and prices and things that were available for that flight to get you there at that time, and options you didn't take. The actual vendor system themselves, I mean, you can go to Staples, you can go to some of these other companies and get a lot more detailed data than the AP listing that basically has it as a one line item for Staples for $10,000, and instead of having all the details. Obviously, the P-card. I found that P-cards, are kind of, I find the best at sort of getting the most data, because the P-card had things like an MCC code. The MCC is like a merchant code, and it will tell you the different types of vendors that are part of that merchant code. And then, finally, some of the other data that you can get is more the Excel spreadsheet Access database. And we do have a sample of data, but before I do that, let me just kind of go one more step on, or two more steps on the data. I think a key point of audit, of doing this is building a system that has all of this data, or as much as you can get. Because, as noted before, just kind of having the disparate data of travel company to like the online T&E system, or P-card data to the online T&E system, people might have an ability to edit what's in the T&E system. So even though P-card data is fed into the T&E system, a lot of times people can edit it. Same thing true for the travel company. So it does, a lot of times people don't even have that sort of interface, but again, with all that said, a lot of times these do interface with one another, and that does control things if people can't edit what's in there. So that in itself is a great control, that if you have the P-card data, you don't really need to audit it as well in the T&E system. So okay, with that said, getting kind of to that data mart of having all that stuff put together, I think is a real, key and something that's very, helpful in sort of building the ultimate system, because the disparate data is where you find, I think, the most, a fair number of issues. I think trending finds the most issues, but I think, disparate data is like number 2 on the list. So deeper into the, the actual tables and fields, there isn't a whole lot here. I mean, it's something, it's pretty simple, I think, and what you'll find is if you download the EPCard data from your travel agent or EPCard system, you'll be amazed at how much data they are tracking. I mean, and time and the location of the vendor and all this other information that you probably wouldn't normally care or think about. But the key fields are listed here. I mean, you obviously want card number and address and city and limit and that kind of thing. One thing that you could do with the cardholder list is you can map it to kind of the list of active cards. So I mean, you could get from the bank, what are the list of cards currently, and kind of map it to the ones that you think are out there, and allow that to kind of tell you if you have other ones that are out there that you thought were terminated, but they're still active. So I think just getting the list is really useful, and kind of mapping it to, say, terminated employee lists or other disparate data. Again, disparate data is where it's at from kind of getting a benefit from a server point of view. The MCC codes are merchant class codes. It gives you a description as well, and then the transactions is where you spend most of the time. That's kind of a sample data file that I have is more of a transaction file, where you have a name and card number and the merchant information, and the MCC code, which is useful to play with, the amount, the currency, and post date. Currency can be confusing. I mean, you can actually think that you just paid a large bill when it really just needs to be converted. So a lot of times the currency field's there, but everything I've seen so far is in U.S. dollars. So I'm not usually looking very further than that. Okay. So the next one is some things that you should think about getting that may not be in there, and we talked about this just for a few times now, so this is good. Is in the data table to get some sort of a business purpose and who was entertained and any sort of remarks. The more text that you can get on that charge, the more they're talking about it, the better, because I think you can learn a lot. And then it's also interesting to look at charges that have no information, right? Ones that have a blank description might be even more interesting. But again, I think the more words you have, the more you can play with. Who was entertained, business purpose, anything else. Then, like we've said, getting that flight or hotel or vendor information and lining it up to what you paid or what you think you paid is also extremely useful as well. And now we've talked through the data, and the types of tables. We're going to show a table in a second here, but I wanted to kind of just start off by kind of talking about now the different types of analytic tests, but more in a general sense. And what I found to date, all of the frauds that we found in T&E were not like a duplicate charge or a round dollar weekend charge or cashback credits or anything like that. It really wasn't that interesting. It was just people that were spending a lot and that they trended over time. And the main thing that I found it on was title. So if a person was like a manager and they were spending more than a senior vice president, that would be a sign, an immediate sign that you need to kind of do something. So looking at some of the trends across spend, which we'll do with some pivot tables in a second here, I think is sort of the number one way of finding things, especially cross-tabulating the enter and approver like we talked about, trending vendors over time, and especially I guess before and after a quarter end. Sorry, I just going back to this. I'm not sure the before and after quarter end makes that much of a difference, but maybe people have like a budget left in December. And figure, ooh, I better go spend all that budget and go buy a bunch of stuff with it. So I mean, it does normally that's reserved more for like revenue fraud and things like that. But I could kind of see how that works. And but is it the trend so much? Are we looking at the trend, Or are we looking at the deviation? And I think we're looking more at the deviation, so even though we're looking at the trend, we're kind of looking for spikes and saying, that's something we need to go do more detailed review of. Then from a deviation point of view, you can do things like above average testing, and just looking for that given vendor, what's above average. You could be looking for duplicate testing. Employee to vendor bank account number testing, and etc. And these are more kind of the specific tests that we'll talk about in a second. Last but not least, I don't think it's a bad idea to just sample, like to kind of get an, like you may not know the exact transactions to pull, but you kind of know that a certain person is throwing off a vibe based on the transactional scoring, like running a lot of reports. You realize that that person's giving off a vibe that other people are not giving off, and you figure, let me go sample that person and pull a few of their expense reports. So I think analytics can kind of guide you with a lot of the trending and get you to a better sample. But I think there are also some specific tests that we'll talk about that are kind of like dead ringers. Whenever you run it, if it kind of shows up, then it's something that we need to be kind of worried about. So just now kind of getting into our next polling question, keeping us on track here. What is not one of the key tables for EPCard analysis? Card holder, travel information, payroll transactions, or MCC code description. And those were the four that we were, or those four, we were talking about a few before on a slide. So what is not one of the key tables for EPCard analysis, the one that we were not talking about on that slide? And I don't see any questions. We'll kind of take a pause here for a minute. I see most of you have voted as well, so leave that open just for another like 20, 30 seconds. And correct, payroll transactions is not what we talked about, although I imagine kind of the payroll direct deposit might be something to look at. I don't know if it would really tell you that much. Like I think that control of, just noting it, I mean, payroll direct deposit of kind of travel and entertainment charges, it would be a data point to go grab, but I'm not sure if it would be that interesting. I mean, that unless somebody kind of doctored what they would end up getting paid from the payroll system, which would be really hard, so I kind of question that. So why it's not the right answer, but also something to think about. One thing from an HR data point of view that I did not mention, and I just go back and mention it now because it just kind of that brought it up to me. In looking at this data, I don't have employee data, and I really should have some sort of just, are they terminated? Are they an employee? And also, I think just getting good employee data, like what department are they in, who do they report to, you might, these are things that I'm not sure would be that helpful, but it does give you a picture of that person. But the key thing that you want to get, and why I'm bringing all this up, is their vacation. And maybe something just to learn like when they're actually on vacation. So now kind of looking at the trends and thinking about, in the data file that I'll open up in a second here, what are the different things that you can look at? I like to boil it down to this who, what, when, where, and why scenario. And the who, what, when, where are things that we can calculate and look at and summarize. And we could do it from a query point of view, a data mining point of view. And but I think the why is sort of based on the above, so you sort of figure out based on the who, what, when, where, what looks weird, and pull that out, and then the deviations, let's say, or actual specific control reports, and then that kind of drives you to like the why you should be looking at that transaction. And going into more detail now, the different types of tests that might be on a who list and we'll start looking at data, is looking at kind of who's authorized to use the TME system, trending it based on that person and kind of looking over time, like maybe creating a score by person. We'll talk about that at the end, but it's something that's a little more advanced. But it's something you could definitely do, and also kind of looking at unstructured data. I mean, you might want to, if you do find somebody that you're concerned about, you might want to take a look at their email data or other information, to like unstructured, to kind of see what you can pull out of it. From a what point of view, I mean, I think that's where we spend a lot of the time. I mean, the who, I think you tend to like summarize it by person and title, and kind of, and again, I think that that's a great way to find fraud just in itself. But the what is looking at things like digital analysis, textual analytics, which we'll talk about, stratifying data, classifying it, looking at things above and below average, which we'll try to run, and et cetera. So let me kind of, with that said, I'm going to show you this stratify your data as well. I'm just showing it to you in the slide here because it's like a little tricky of a VLOOKUP, so I'm just kind of putting that as its own slide. But as we kind of get into our data file here, just bear with me 1 minute. Just need to grab it. So the data file that everyone should have is this EPCard data file, and I guess there are a couple of pivot tables and such that we have in here. I should kind of scroll over to them so you can see them. They're all over here, and they're all pre-built. So I mean, you can kind of look at this and hopefully use some of these just in your own kind of processing. This is doctored up data, but it is it has like a valid MCC code and such, but otherwise it's pretty doctored up. And what I tend to do whenever I get a data file like this, is to very quickly put it into a pivot table. So from a trending point of view, that's what we'll do here. I only have about 454 transactions, so that's kind of what it's telling me here. And this allows me, the pivot table view allows me to kind of see what is in here from a fields point of view. And I think, one of the things we would first do is set up an MCC code and an MCC code description. And I might even just get rid of the code and just go for the description. Then what we'll do is kind of bring in the amount field into the values and just now get a perspective of kind of MCC code by amount. So the last thing that we'll do here is to basically then bring in the post date. And I think that unfortunately, from a date point of view, I may only have stuff kind of in the June 2012 timeframe, so it doesn't give you as good of a perspective by date, but I did still want to do it so that you could kind of see, if you then pulled into the years and month, that you would be given kind of your spend over time in columns in a cross-tabulated format. And all I've done is kind of move things into, say, from a row to a column perspective. So another pivot table that I created over here was just, I didn't have a name for the vendor, but I just summarized the vendor here and then had a vendor MCC code at the top and vendor on the left-hand side as my row. And all of that is happening in this pivot table field list where you can do almost everything from here. You can move it and such, but I tend to just leave it here. Sometimes I can move this up a little bit, to see what's down there a little more, or that down a bit. But aside from that, what we can do is go into something like the value field settings and change the format of that value to look a little bit better, like I've done here. You could put commas and quotation marks, let's say. And that's sometimes a good thing, just to be able to read the numbers a little bit better. But another thing is you can start to chart your data, and I find, looking at a schedule like this, which I'm going to scroll out on just so you can see it. It's really small, but you can see I have like maybe about 200 vendors on the left-hand side, and I have these merchant class descriptions going out across the top. What you can do is kind of chart that, and I'm going to scroll out of this chart a bit so you can see it. It is, a pretty small chart. I mean, it definitely isn't something that is that easy to see. And this is sample data. We're only looking at like a month's worth of data here. But what we're looking at is each vendor and the different types of MCC codes that they're processing into. And it may be interesting to look for a given vendor. Let me scroll into this now. And all you do there is you can use this kind of scroll bar down below here. And by scrolling into it, you can quickly kind of see some of the MCC code and vendor categories, like that particular vendor number, and see whether or not there's a trend there, especially for a given vendor. Like I think this one here, I think it's college and universities. They have quite a bit happening in two different. Bear with me, two different vendors, but it's about the same amount. So I mean, again, it almost looks like a duplicate kind of amount vendor scheme. And once you find that, I don't know of a way yet of like clicking and drilling down so much on that. I mean, I think you can highlight some of the information and have it open up. But I tend to just go back here and filter to whatever we needed. So if it was kind of this, I think it was college and universities. What that allows you to do is just kind of bring in, whatever you're filtering on by just kind of clicking down on that filter button and highlighting. And I think many of you should have this. Like I mean, this is something for 2010 users, but I do want to kind of show this to you quickly because it's I think really a cool option. In your pivot table tools, you have something called the slicer, so you can insert a slicer. We can put MCC code or maybe the MCC code description. And what it'll do is highlight all of these different options. And what I'll do is I'll bring it down to maybe like 4 columns and drag this out. But what's nice about the slicer, if you can read it and it's kind of it works, is you can sit here and just very quickly kind of click around and like go back to that chart and look at who are some of the big vendors that we have from an airline point of view. The college and universities, it was only one vendor, but I clicked on Continental, we got a couple for that, but fast food restaurants, okay, so this might be a little more interesting. But just looking at who is that one, right, that they're like 5 times as much as everyone else. And I mean, this can be done in a lot of different ways, but I like that if you have Excel 2010 or greater, you can make use of these slicers, and I find that's really cool. Let me get rid of the slicer now, though, just to go back and take a look at the charts themselves. Let me just get rid of that filter. So that gets us back here. There are ways of even inserting a slicer here as well, but I find sometimes it's just easier to kind of do it in the data sheet and then go over to the chart. One of the top tests that I've found fraud on, not in T&E but in general ledger, but I always run it no matter what, is taking a look at this vendor date chart, and this is just kind of, and this is some old data in here that we had from a payables data, but I threw that in here into this pivot so you could see it. Because invariably there's always like a few days in a year that really kind of drive out cost, and it's something that you can very quickly see and identify like a few dates where everybody got on a plane and went down to some conference or what have you, and I think a lot of that is normal. So I don't know if that's something of concern. But I do think just looking at some of the top dates has a lot of good potential to it. This one, and again, it's a really hard thing to see until you scroll into it. But this one here is basically every account down below here, and then a timing of that information. And because we had so few days, I kind of put the days in there. You know, from a account to date point of view, we had so few days in there. I ended up just kind of doing it more in a daily fashion, so it's not that many. But usually you'll want to do this in like a monthly or quarterly type fashion as well. So you know what I have found there, you know, there are a few different ways of doing that. But let me just kind of, so in getting through these charts, I wanted to show a few different options, and this is a great way to find the deviations, you know, from the trending. And I think sometimes too, in the deviation analysis that you're doing, and I'll just try to find a good example here, taking out continental from this particular, you know, grouping. Like if we go down here and just try to take out continental because they're really kind of driving a lot of the spend. Like we know they're big, so let's go back. It really kind of brings it to something a lot more useful or user-friendly to look at. This is delta, you know, so okay, well, let's now take out delta. And my reason of doing this is to kind of show you that these graphs sometimes don't look so good on the onset, but I still think the graph is the best way for us to look at data and quickly make sense of it and dive into it. And again, this, even just though it's 1 month of data that we're looking at and playing with here, it does provide you with an ability to look at maybe about 10 spikes that are very much above an average for that given spend. And so again, trending and utilizing this is a great kind of first step in anything. Some of the other things, though, that I think you can do, and it's not that hard to do, you know, in taking a look, is you might want to take a look at spend to people's credit limits and take a look at that. But I do find that the actual vendor is quite good at kind of blocking people after a credit limit. The other thing, obviously, is in taking a look at this data is you might want to geocode the vendor zip code. And I don't have it in this product because this is Excel 2010. I don't believe, but there is something that comes in 2013, and it becomes like a new thing here, and it's called Power Map, and that allows you to kind of map your data. And that's something that you know I find that is you know been really useful in just quickly getting a sense of where things are, and you know seeing kind of maybe how you can maybe consolidate your spending, or maybe take a look in further in certain areas where you're doing a lot of spending in a given area, and get a hotel or you know meal places to have a good meal where it's a lot cheaper and you get discounted rates and things like that. Just looking here. One of the things that I wanted to show you was coding of data, and this is kind of a simple thing, but you know what I like to do is add a lot of fields to my data. So this would be like an absolute value of an amount. The other one might be setting up some sort of a stratification. So we'll call it the stratify range, and we have this in our slides, but we'll do this in a second. Another thing that you might want to set up in here would be something of like a Benford law. So you know you could we'll call this Benford 1. And what I like, you know, the reason I like to do some of this is to try to give more depth or information to the data when you're doing pivot tabling. So for like create date, we have that in here. I would what do I want to put here? I think I'm just going to put the month just for right now. So let me kind of quickly go back to this and say, how would you build this? What I generally do is, like, if I want to do the Benford Law one, we'll do that one first. We'll take a look at the left-hand side of that, and we'll do that for the first digit. And that generally will work on the absolute value of dollars. If there are some pennies in here, sometimes it doesn't work so well. You get a 0 in that case. But that is a pretty good way of getting Benford Law to work, is just to have an absolute value and then the Benford Law. The month is also pretty easy. You can just do the month range and take a look at the create date, and it comes in as a date, so you want to change that to number. And so that is November. this is June, that's August, etc. These are all the months. The stratify range is a little trickier, and I'm just going to go over here. What you want to do is have, and just bear with me 1 minute here. So what I tend to do is say, we'll just kind of put under 0. I always have that, I have like a -1 here first as a limit to get rid of anything that is under 0 or 0. But basically this is over 0 and under 100. And then this is, over 0 to 100. And then this one is 100 to 1,000. And then this is over 1,000. And what this stratify range does is, I think it gives you a much better perspective on your data. So let's kind of go over to the, I'm going to VLOOKUP this value field, $38 credit, and I'm going to do it to this range over here. And I hit the F4 button, just like in the slide, to basically denote whether or not, or denote it as a fixed table so that we don't change it. And I'm now going to change my VLOOKUP to be true. So it's not false, but true, and that's kind of odd. But what that does is it kind of does a ranging type of analysis where it says, if it's under 0, put these here. I always put this -1 here because it tends to, sometimes I find you almost have to have like a bottom limit, so I put that in there for safety's sake. But then these here are you can keep going with that and go 1,000 to 10,000, whatever. But that stratify range, now that I have it and I insert a pivot table, what I can do is work off of the stratify range, if I can find it. Bear with me. Sometimes, this is a good test, you have to refresh your data. So I just refresh that. And what we can do is kind of put into the stratify range by account number and then maybe do a count per person. So what we're trying to show here, I don't know if I can, I should have put labels on it to be a little bit better, like 1, 2, 3. But what this does is this stratifies the data into these groupings by a cardholder. We don't have a lot of data here to get a real sense, but I think it gives you a good idea when people are only spending in a high range or so. The other thing that you can do is keep the stratify range up there and now work off of the month of the year and just kind of looking at the range of what's happening by month. And this is just a count, and I do that to kind of keep it more simplistic. But if I now pivot chart that, just the count itself, I'll try, we'll try for a 3D column if we can get it here, or 3D, we'll get a little more intricate, try something like that. This gives you another way of looking at your data, but then also kind of realizing that there are certain months where some of the strata are going off kilter. And this first one here, I think it's the 100 to 1,000. You can see in February, when you look in this graph, you can see that the February month has a bit of an out of whack scenario for that strata. And I like to do this on strata because, again, it's almost like a way that people don't expect you to look. So it's a great way to kind of work on things. You can get more advanced, and I'll just kind of end with this by taking the MCC code. You could put it up in the report area instead of a slicer if you don't have that. So if you put it in the report area, and then you could pick a given MCC code, and a lot of them just had activity like in one time frame. But if we pick like 3 of them, we get a little bit better. And I mean, it is something where you can isolate just a few MCC codes and do this analysis, and that might be a better way of getting kind of an overall analysis and range. So I wanted to kind of head back to the slides now. We've gone through a lot of trending, and I still think that that's, taking a look at the who, what, when, where, and why at a high level is still very good. one thing that I'm just noting to you is to do a scatter graph and maybe take a look at differences between years. So this is like a difference between year. You can do this in a pivot table by having kind of remember we put like the months in the columns. There's no reason why you couldn't put the year in the column and look at it by merchant, by person. But I think doing a year-over-year analysis is probably one of the best, ways of looking at it from a when point of view. So let's kind of get into the other sections, right? We did the who and the what. We're still going to talk about textual analytics and a few other things, but I now wanted to talk about the where. And geo-mapping is something that's gotten popular, but there's also doing things like maybe mapping this data to a list of people. So just kind of continuing on through this, later in the presentation we'll talk about the other lists that you can map to, but it's something where you can even kind of map things in Excel from a geomap point of view and show that, and I want to show that to you because I think it's a really neat way of doing it. What's nice about the geomapping is if you don't find addresses, it will basically show you addresses that didn't show up in the in there, and I think that can be really interesting and useful. We did a lot of the when analysis. One thing we didn't do is the weekend analysis, so I'll jump in and do a couple of examples there. But I think weekend and round dollar is interesting as well. And then the why would be kind of just taking a look at all these deviations, from the who, what, when, and where, and putting it together to then determine more on, kind of why you're taking a look at that given vendor. So let me kind of dive back into the data here for a second, and I just want to show you now. A lot of people do travel on weekends, but the weekend function, you basically use weekday, and you go over to whatever date you want, and if it comes up with a 7 or a 1, then that's a weekday. So a 1 here is that's a weekend, and that's basically a Sunday, that number 1. So all right, continuing on here. So that was that particular data. From the geo-mapping point of view, there are a few products that you can get. I'm just going to show you quickly a video here. If I can bring this up. Hold on one second. And what this will show you is you can actually build this, and I put the employees on top of vendors, so the employee is red, the vendor is blue, and it changes to blue and yellow. And what's neat about the geo mapping of Excel is it allows you to kind of build these videos as well. So you can kind of make a nice little video. So it's a free feature, but you do need Excel 2013. If you don't have that product, let me just kind of head back here. If you don't have that product, and this is kind of Excel 2013, Office 365 too. A lot of times, like one person in the department can get access to Excel 2013, and you might want to, ask management for it, because it not only tells you the addresses that don't match the GeoMap service, but it also kind of does all these cool things. There is MapPoint, which is a Microsoft product. It costs like $300 or so, but you can buy this and use MapPoint too, and that is kind of the same thing as what we just talked about with the geo-mapping. Okay, so kind of getting into some of the top reports. We talked about a lot of these, but I just giving you kind of more of a laundry list to think about and use in some of your analysis. But definitely the decline, the cashback credits, as somebody noted, cashback credits is like the first thing everybody asks for whenever we do these audits is, let's take a look at what cash they're getting back. Cards that haven't had activity in many months that now have activity or just have no activity and just kind of curious why they're out there. Taking a look at some of the newly added merchants, so that's kind of like last year, this year. If you do that analysis, that stuff quickly kind of comes out. The duplicates, which we haven't really talked about yet, I find going into Excel, we'll show you how to do a duplicate, but you can do duplicates on card numbers, amount, transaction date, and we'll definitely, we do find a few duplicate payments. What I find is the duplicates between the accounts payable and T&E EPCard, that fourth bullet down. That is the most prevalent that we end up finding. Posting to unusual MCC codes, like just going through that summary list that we had before, is kind of a great way of looking at things. And we talked about near the approval limit, and let me just, before I go to this one, let me just kind of go back into some of these top reports. I just wanted to go into Excel and just quickly show you how to do a duplicate testing. And one of the ways I think that the most easy way to do it is to go out and get a product like a Teammate Analytics, which I don't have loaded on this machine, but or Active Data. I find that this, for the money, it's only a few $100s. It tends to do a much better job quickly. So I could say like MCC code. We had an amount in here, same amount. And then you could even try for like different vendor, vendor number, vendor ID, and you can even do like a different test, and these are all just kind of weird tests that I'm doing, but you can see the flexibility that this gives you. Let me just try to see if I do have any duplicates. Okay, so I did have some duplicates on amount, and so it was same amount, same MCC code, and then same vendor, which in some cases was just 0, which is weird in itself. But going back to EPCard data, if you don't have active data and you want to kind of do this yourself, you can do a concatenate function, but I can never, I guess we could use that. But I end up just using ampersand, so you could take vendor ID, ampersand. I might put something in the middle of that, like a dash, ampersand. Bear with me, and just say MCC code just for now, just to kind of keep this simple. And what that does is it creates this concatenated field, which you can copy down by double-clicking on that little button on the bottom right-hand corner of the cell, and that gives you kind of a duplicate key. So with that duplicate key, you could highlight that, go to your, there are a few different options, but you have conditional formatting, and you can highlight duplicate values, and you'll notice I have a lot of them. So that the same vendor, same merchant code, happens a lot. So let me kind of add into that just one more item here, and then kind of going over now to that amount field, if I could find that. So we'll just do that amount field and add those up. And still, we have a fair number of duplicates showing up, but it is still something where you can do it through this duplicate key. Once you've done that and identified kind of the duplicates, this way you can highlight and basically say, I just want to kind of text filter on that particular highlight or conditional formatting that we've selected. Okay, so just getting back to the slides here. And just going through a variety of other reports, and we noted a few of these, but I just wanted to kind of note, kind of looking at external data, etc. Was quite good. Now just going into the next polling question, because I feel like we're at time for polling questions here, and but let me just do this last note here in the slide. We had the cost recovery opportunity test too. I think if you start finding vendors that only have one account or one person that's using them, it's like a sole source to that vendor, and you can figure that out by a pivot table. You just summarize it by person and vendor, and you can immediately see who's only working with that vendor. I think you have an opportunity to look for money. I mean, one area we noticed was people had a lot of mobile phone usage, and they were basically putting through like their mobile phones on the expense report, but they were also given another mobile phone to use as well. So they had like 2 of them, And Telcom kind of found that out, and were pretty impressed with that test. But we didn't know what we were doing. We just were kind of looking at charges. But in all, of all these tests so far that we've been doing, I do find a lot of the specific tests are quite good, but that the trending's good as well. And we didn't have time to talk about the scatter graph that shows the volume and values quite well. I still think that's something that you could build via a pivot table by looking at the 2 years over time, and then using that scatter chart to kind of show the volume and value in one place. And that's that trend analysis by vendor scatter graph. So with that, let me kind of dive into the next polling question. What Excel chart shows value and volume differences in one view? Scatter graphs, pivot tables, VLOOKUP, or data analysis toolkit? So, a couple of questions. One is, how do you identify Square merchant vendors in there? I've actually seen them listed as Square as the vendor name, so that's how we identified them. I don't know. Yeah, if they change their name to some other name, it would be very difficult. It kind of goes back to the other tests that you could run. Split transactions, looking at things right under a limit. You can use the stratification that we just talked about to kind of stratify right under a limit. So you might want to look at things like 900 to 999. And by doing so, you can look at only those items that are under that limit or in that limit, and then you could summarize on that strata and see what vendors have tons of transactions that are happening in that strata. So that's why I show the strata. It's great for that approval limit test and just trending in general. I see most of you voted. We're looking for others, so I'll just leave this out here for another minute or so. And I'll close out the poll in just another few seconds here. I don't see any other questions coming in, so that's good. Okay, let me just close that and share that with everybody. And what Excel chart is best. It is the scatter graph or scatter chart that we were talking about just a minute ago. And I find it does a great job of just showing volume and value in this like one view kind of way. It's great. Okay, so in looking at background searches, I think a lot of people will do background searches of employees and make sure that they don't have any real issues or problems in their background. But in looking at vendors as well, you might want to find, if you have a certain vendor or two that you're spending a lot of money with, you can do a lot of online research. And here's just one book. I kind of bought an earlier version of this, but I got an image of it because I thought it was a good book where you can learn a lot about just public records and how you can look up in public records companies. There's also kind of the state filings, the SAM.gov service that will show, or SAM.gov is a website that you could go out to and download exclusion list information. IRS TIN matching for any sort of merchant TINs that are there, but usually that's okay, I find. Now, what I tend to do is, based on looking at all this data analytics and looking at merchants that are popping out, you might want to do more research on a given vendor. So you could actually do like a kind of like a little summary and take a Google image of their place of business, and let's say the place of business does not look like what there is below. It looks like a little apartment building somewhere. That might be cause for concern. And all of this is available on Google now. I mean, you could, once you get a few addresses that you're interested in, you can easily go out there and take a look. The one document that's hard to find, so there are a couple out there, the OFAC and the SAM.gov. If you type in OFAC list, it's from the U.S. Treasury, you'll find it, SAM.gov. The IRS TIN matching will immediately bring you to the IRS website. So a lot of this is pretty easy to find. The CIA World Leader List is not as hard to find, and that's why I put it here. You can kind of see in that version here, it says like click here for prior versions, and you can download a PDF version. What people do is they bring this into Excel or ACL. I have an ACL script to kind of convert it as an example that will essentially reformat the data so that you can get out of it just like a data file that you can then do a VLOOKUP on. And that's something where you can kind of search or do like a keyword search or VLOOKUP search for that given name in your teeny data. And what I would generally find or where you want to look is in the people that are being entertained. Are they showing up as a world leader or associated with a world leader? And is the person putting that in their expense report under like business purpose or who was entertained? But this is becoming really popular now, so I wanted to note that. Other things to kind of look at. I'll come back to this slide in a second. I meant to just show this. Is thinking about kind of where activity is happening and aligning that to external data. Like this is a corruption index, I believe, or this is fraud, the median fraud by country. And Canada's kind of surprising, when you see that there, but I think they just had a few big things happen or something. But in looking at this, it gives you an idea of where there is more fraud or less. And there are many other indices out there, like corruption indices out there that you could look at and think about, if maybe we should focus on more activity in those areas. I did want to jump into like textual analytics and show you a little bit here and give you a sense of how to do this. There is a great article. It's from 2002, but it's from WorldCom NCI and that case. And it basically said, if somebody was looking for the word line costs, that showed up in there. And this was even from Wikipedia, where we learn more about, corporate unallocated revenue account. Those types of words, if we were looking at journal entry descriptions or general ledger account descriptions, I think we would learn a lot about this. We would gain this new knowledge of, if a person is putting through a new type of journal entry, it should show up pretty quickly. And I find, though, from a T&E point of view, it tends to be more of an FCPA violation that people are worried about, that we're doing foreign activity and corrupt foreign activity. And these are some of the red flags. I'm just highlighting them here. I'm not, this isn't so much of an FCPA case, but it's more or less bribery or corruption to kind of win sales or just for personal gain. And some of the things you could do is a bit of a word search. So we'll show a small data file there, and then there's some real advanced stuff that you could do as well. But the simple word search is not that hard to do, and we'll quickly show kind of the more advanced stuff that you could do here with kind of the letters and words. But in summary, before I dive into all this Excel stuff, I wanted to just note, it is a way to kind of look at data and very quickly get a sense of what's going on. So if you looked at all the business purposes and summarized it, if people went to a lot of conferences, it would really kind of show up, as conferences would be like the #1 word in the data, or for example. And what you should be doing is looking for deviations over time. I think it's good to kind of do a search right as now, but it's also good to kind of look at it over time. And I think, like Benford's law, that digital analysis, like what's the first digit of each number, which I didn't have time to really go in and explain, but if you look that up, and many of you know it, I think that looking at the words is almost like the Benford law, but from a word perspective. So before I go into this final bit here, let me just go back to a couple of things in Excel. One thing would be if we had some sort of text here, like to increase revenues with a plug entry, and these were the actual words or phrase. What you could do is kind of paste that here, and you can split it up, kind of like I've done up here, by using text to columns. So I can take this data here and go Data, Text to Columns, which is a button right in the middle, and I could say Delimited and go Next. And just kind of say space, and that will delimit on the space and kind of create what we have below here, and that's essentially what I had copied up to here. So text to columns will break it up for you. What you can then do over here is make a lookup table of that data. So what I did was I created a VLOOKUP. We'd done a VLOOKUP before, and that VLOOKUP is looking at that word, the word to, and it's looking at this big list, or list of 36 words. And if there's a match, it'll come back with that given word. So it'll actually kind of list it here. So increase was one of the words that we had. So obviously all those items here are showing up with the word increase, and plug is another one, and that shows up later. But I think doing this type of analysis, breaking up a description field, even doing it simply like this is a good way to go. There are other kind of tools out there to do textual analytics. I have one that, again, just to show you something a little more advanced, but realizing this isn't part of the course, but more just showing you what you can do. What I did here was I summarized down to the actual word itself and the word order. So where is that word showing up? So going back to what we had here, the word to is in the first position, increase second position, third position. So going back to here, you can immediately see what is the first position word. That's that position word, and then the letter, the first letter in that word. And then what I did was I have a year 1 and a year 2. So I have 2 different years of data in here. And bear with me 1 second here. And just what I've done in looking at this is I've pivot tabled this a lot of different ways. So again, without going into this too much, what you could do is kind of look at all of the items. And I've looked at that in this pivot chart here, where we basically have the letters A through Z out here, and then we have the first year and the second year for each word occurrence. So there were 10 word occurrences, and it kind of has year 1 and year 2. And it gives you this idea of being able to kind of look at your data and look at kind of variations. Now, what I find, and this is kind of a an interesting segment, I'm looking at, bear with me one here. Well, let me just kind of get to here. So this is kind of just looking at one letter, but if I look at everything, you can kind of see how there's a real fingerprint to the data where, year 1 and year 2 are not that far off. And what you can do by looking, and the reason this happens is that people tend to use the same words as part of their descriptions. You can break up things into the letters and then break it up by year. You can create this really nice fingerprint of data. So I wanted to show you something a little more advanced. I mean, definitely beyond this course today, but to give you that idea of what you could do if you could figure out the word order and for each word and put a letter to each one of those. By doing so, again, I think textual analytics can gain this much better perspective of data than you've had before. So just to close out, just actually Jim noting a really great point, thank you. There is a Death Master that you can download, the Social Security deathmasterfile.com, and it's ssdmf.com. And just going back to this slide here of where else you could look, taking that Death Master and going across, be it an employee, I guess a vendor, it could be an individual, and taking a look is really interesting. I've never found somebody, well, we have found people that did pass away, but the reality was they had terminated employment by passing away, sadly. So it's something where you do find a few matches, but they're usually not the ones that are fraud-based. So just to kind of conclude, I wanted to go through a few more slides on transactional scoring. So, we've done all this different type of analytics, textual analytics, digital analytics, looking at things from a who, what, when, where, why, and all these reports. And ultimately what is a really good idea is to kind of bring it together into one analysis so that you have a score. And I think a lot of times, that's why we have credit scores, and why, I find that the credit card companies can score your transactions and kind of highlight people that they need to pull out. These are all the benefits of scoring. And I think for our perspective, what you can do is pull reports together. And we'll show you a simple example of that. But by doing so, you're kind of killing more birds with one stone. You're ending up, looking for an item that is part of a duplicate charge, that's round, that's strange from a textual analytic perspective, and pulling that out. And by doing so, one example could be, employees with low transaction high dollars and high proportion of round payments, and people that exceed average payments to that employee, and a high proportion of charges over limits. These are all kind of reports that you can run, pretty quickly in Excel. And now what I want to show you is just how do we kind of bring that together. So a couple of the files that we gave to you were these scoring files. And it's an example sheet scoring or joining the scores. And all we're doing here is I have, let's say, a supplier number and whether or not they showed up on report 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which is all highlighted here. So we have kind of the report 1 score, report 2, report 3. And each one of them kind of ties back to, this schedule here, based on supplier number. So each one, let's look at report 1. We had whether or not the person showed up on it, and if they did, they got this 0.1 score. Other scores later get like a 0.2 score. So if it's a higher ranking report, like schedule number 5, that will also kind of throw off the score if they showed up. And the way we're doing it is a VLOOKUP. We're VLOOKUPing that supplier number to that report 1 and determining if they have a score. So report 1, we should have a score for vendor 5, and vendor 5, we have a score. So again, this then allows you to bring together into a summarized way what employees showed up on all the reports, what employees showed up on just 1 or 2 reports, and that gives you a score that you can then highlight people to hopefully look more into and take a look for. And the key here is VLOOKUP. That's kind of what's bringing it ultimately all together. Once you do the scoring, it gives you an ability to analyze based on the dollar amount, based on the dollar amount as well as kind of the score itself. And you can see at the bottom here kind of the percentage score for each vendor. Each dot is a vendor, and then we have the total dollar amount, by vendor, and that's kind of shown in this chart here. All right. So at this point, continuing on here, I guess we just have kind of one last polling question, then we'll get into the final questions that people had. And this is kind of going back a little bit, but which of the following are key to EPCard fraud control framework? Employee training, reviewing the data, booking it for them, automated workflow, or all of the above? We'll give everybody just a minute or so. This pretty much concludes the session. We have some closing slides and some questions that came in, like how are you populating the tabs? And a lot of them were pre-populated. Some of the sheets that I was showing just a minute ago I did not provide because they're more proprietary. But you can give me a call if you're interested in that type of analytics, like the textual analytics that we were doing a second ago. But hopefully I've answered your question there in that regard. But the actual tabs that you had from before, the actual worksheets that you had in the data, it comes with about 5 or 6 charts already kind of pre-developed for you. And obtaining the PowerPoint, you should have it or have a link to it. But anybody who wants the PowerPoint as well, I imagine we can get that to them. That's part of the registration process. So I'm just going to close this poll just to kind of close this out and get into our concluding slides. We're coming up on the hour here. I'm going to share that with everybody. You got it all right. All of the above was correct. And let me hide that poll. And just kind of closing out for the day here. If I didn't, let me just, we basically have the question slides, so please throw them in. I have answered all the questions so far. I know Peter has with Fraud Resource Net has a whole program lined up for 2015. I'm doing a few of the sessions, and then there's other people as well doing the sessions. There is a subscription offer. Subscribe to Fraud Resource Net and you get a free copy of the webinar CD, Data Mining for Payroll Fraud. So take a look at that as well. And White Collar Crime Fighter is part of Fraud Resource Net, and I've been getting this for years, and a lot of great case studies and things that are going on, and a lot of good examples that you can use and show to people, and maybe come up with new kind of reports yourself. And auditsoftwarevideos.com for free. A question came in, so I'll kind of relate the question to this. Do I have a cheat sheet for the various formulas that you used in the with the pivot tables in Excel? I don't exactly, but I will tell you that Audit Software Videos is a free way of learning Excel and ACL and IDEA and Active Data, which is that product I showed you. And you can go out there and sign up for that, and we have many hours of videos you could watch. We do have a whole section on Excel functions, and so you can actually go there and watch a video on it, and just kind of quickly bring this over here, like how you would do that. You go to auditsoftwarevideos.com, and you just go to the training topics, Excel functions macros, and I've been kind of moving more to video, so in what I'm doing, and this gives you a lot on date ranges, on stratifying the data, and there should be more in here. And now that I'm looking at this, I would even say in our top menu, to answer your function question, you could also go to statistics, and that's where we do a lot on Benford's Law and such. So there's that. The week day function and the mod function are the week, basically the day of the week, and the round dollar functions, and those are really popular as well. Bring that back. But again, I do thank you for the presentation today and everybody coming out, and I don't know if there are any other questions coming in, but I don't see any other questions coming in. I know we're almost at the top of the hour here, so we did pretty good on time. And again, hopefully you can use these slides as a bit of an audit program for yourself, and I tried my best to kind of come up with lots of report ideas and throw them in here, but also noting you don't have to run them all. I think it's something where trending the data can do almost everything that you need initially.
Rich, thank you for another outstanding cutting-edge presentation on data analytics and fraud. My guess is that all of our participants and attendees will have gotten some enlightening and actionable information out of it. So our thanks to you again, as always. Before we go, quickly, just a reminder that you'll receive an evaluation form when you log out of the webinar today. And we'd love it if you just take a few seconds to complete it so that we can help develop even better webinars in the future. Not that there's a whole lot to improve on here, I would say, with regard to Rich's, and we look forward to his future participation, as he mentioned earlier, in 2015. And as there are no more questions for Rich at this point, we just want you to know that you have on your screen there our contact information, and we welcome any questions that may come upon your radar in the future, tomorrow, the next day, or a month from now. Just send them over to us by email. We'll make sure we get an answer for you. Any final thoughts for the day or the hour, Rich Lanza?
No, thanks. I'm trying to think that book that I mentioned that, how to pad your expense report. I hate to tell people to buy it, but it probably is a fun read, right, of anything. It's a pretty small book, but it does give you a lot of like schemes and ideas that I tried to get in the presentation today, but I think reading that book kind of comes up with more ideas, and I think that's probably it, is brainstorm from what we've done today to kind of come up with the precise list for you. But yeah, I think you could do almost everything in Excel, which is great.
Yeah, I think that is true. And there is obviously a learning curve to all of these tools, but from my understanding and interaction with experts like Rich and others, it is well worth the investment of time and effort to learn the tricks. On behalf of Jim Kaplan, myself, and Fraud Resource Net, thank you again, Richard, and thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. And we look forward to hosting you again in the very near future. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks.